Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to finally bring a tutorial which a lot of you guys have been requested since I started the channel, which is a tutorial on Redux. So Redux is a very well-known library that allows you to conduct some state management in your React application. It is probably the most famous state management library out there, and there are many reasons why you would want to learn it. I've been critical of Redux in the past, but I don't want to pass the bad impression that I don't think it is a good library. I just think that it is really hard for beginners to understand because of the amount of boilerplate code that you need to use in order to actually get your Redux application to be working. Even for something as simple as a counter app, you would need a lot of boilerplate code that you wouldn't need if you were using other tools, such as, for example, the context API that is already built into React. But that's not to say that Redux is very useful in many different situations. And I feel like nowadays, one of the main reasons why you would want to learn Redux is because a job posting requires it. And that's okay, that's totally okay. Many companies started using Redux because it was one of the only options out there in the beginning, and it is really hard to migrate your code from using Redux to using something else. So many companies are stuck with using Redux, and they probably enjoy it. It's not that bad. So this video would be mainly for people who either want to learn Redux because they want to use Redux in their applications, or for those people who want to learn Redux because they need to use Redux in their applications. So I'll try to make it as simple as possible, and this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to make a Redux video in the beginning, because I was trying to find a way to explain it in a way that it is as beginner friendly as possible, and I think I came up with a good explanation, which in my mind, I feel like if I were a beginner, I would probably at least get a sense of what Redux is. So before we get into the video, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. It would help push my videos to more people, and as a consequence, I would be able to provide more videos for you guys. So I would massively appreciate if you guys could support the channel. And yeah, let's get into the tutorial. So as you can see over here, we have this this little diagram that I made over here, which is very simple, but I think it will exemplify to you guys at least the basics of what Redux is or what state management is in React. So if you're a beginner in React, I would say that one of the first things that you learn is what is the state of a React application, or what is the use state hook. And that's really important because you will be using it to make it so that your application, your web page, is dynamic. If you want to change something in the page, just create a state and then change its value. That's something that you learned since the beginning. However, if you have a simple application like this one over here, where you start with the app component at the top, and you have several components that you call inside of this app component. To make it as simple as possible, let's try to just have two components. A component which is called login and a component which is called profile. Now imagine that they handle different things, right? The login component is where you write the code for logging into a profile, right? You log in as a user, you maybe be able to add a username, your name, your email, your age, whatever. You put information about the user. And then the whole point of the profile, as in every single profile page out there, it's just to display your information. And maybe, if you really want to, you can also edit the information that the user created and change it and then also display it in this component. So the main point of this is that this component should be used mostly for like logging in and creating the user, and this component should be mainly used for displaying information and maybe updating and changing the values that were created on this component. Now this over here is kind of tricky because if you're a beginner, you would probably think about creating a state called user inside of the login, but then it becomes kind of weird because how can you access that information, that state, in the profile component, right? Because in React you can't pass states to sibling components. Think of it as a tree. We start at the top and then we have branches, right? You can't pass states to two branches that are currently childs of our parent over here. And that's kind of weird, but one of the solutions to that is maybe you create the user state on the app component, right? Because then you can do it in many ways. You can pass it as props. So you pass the state and the function that changes that state value as props to the login, and you also pass it as props to the profile. Now we have it in our app, and we can access in everything that is below it, which in sense makes like it works. You can definitely make this work this way. However, if you have an application with 1,000 states, not 1,000, but a lot of states, and you really want to be able to access the user information in a component that is like way down there in the tree, you really don't want to keep passing your states through props, because that will become extremely messy and unorganized. So for that reason, you really want to focus on state management for different states that you want to have access throughout your component tree. And Redux allows you to do that because you can create something called a store, which holds on to information about different states that you might want to access throughout your application, and that store will exist on the highest level. Usually it's not even created on the app component, it's created on the index file, which calls the app component, but that's later on. I'll get into this. But basically, you create something called a store, which will hold all of those states, and which also allows you to modify those states. And then, instead of passing through your props, you can just call that store and access that store throughout every component that is below. And that is good because now you can have a whole application where you have states that are global states and you can access throughout any component without actually passing them through props, by just using simple tools that are already created throughout your specific state management library. I know it might seem a bit confusing while we're just looking at this design, but I want to get started with the code so you guys can get a better sense of it. And believe me, it's not that complicated. It's just that it has a bunch of steps that you need to take, and I will be going over every single step so that you guys can at least understand why they're used and why they are necessary, and then you can implement this on your own application. So let's get started with the code. Okay, everyone. So as you can see, I want to start from scratch. So I have an empty project inside of my computer that I opened on VS Code. And the first thing we want to do is, as always, we want to install React and create a React project. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see it better. And I want to run npx create React app like this. And I want to create it inside of this project and run the command. So this should start creating your React application, and I'll be back in a second when the application is finished creating. So now, as you can see over here, we have installed our React application, and I want to actually start now by installing all the different dependencies and packages that we're going to be using. And as you might imagine, they're all related to Redux. So the packages we're going to be using is, first of all, we're going to install Redux in itself, which, by the way, if you don't know, Redux is not only for React, it is actually a JavaScript state management library. So you can use Redux in other JavaScript libraries, such as Angular, for example. But this tutorial is specifically for React. So in order to connect Redux to React, we have to install another package called React-Redux, like this. And also, I want to point out that this tutorial will be using something called Redux-Toolkit, which is a very famous package, which is now making Redux be a lot easier than what it used to be. And I want to point out that Toolkit is probably not used as much on the tutorials that you see on YouTube, but it is being used a lot in real life. You'll find that there aren't a lot of tutorials using Toolkit because it's relatively new compared to just using React, Redux, and Redux on itself. However, since I want to make this as beginner friendly as possible, I will be using Redux Toolkit. And also, even if this wasn't for a beginner, I would also use Redux Toolkit, just because there's no reason for not using it when it simplifies the way you use Redux in an application by a lot. So in order to get this to be working in your app, I would come over here and add the package, which would be at Redux.js, like this, and then we put a /toolkit, like this. And when we press enter, this should start installing the 3 libraries that we will be using in our application. And when it's done installing, I'll be back in a second. Okay, so as you can see, we just finished installing everything, and I'm going to clear out my terminal, and let's take a look at our application. So over here we have our application, as you can see, and it's looking good. We have our files that already come with the create React app command, and I'm gonna start out by deleting some of these files just because I always do this whenever I create a new application. We're gonna delete the test files, the logo, and the index.css. And let's throw them to the trash. And in the index.js, let's delete the import statement for the index.css, and it should all be fine. Let's also delete everything that already comes with the app.js, and let me delete the logo, and I'll save it. So we have our simple app over here. Let me just write hello world just to check to see if everything is working. And let's run our app by running npm start, like this. You should see that it will start running everything, and I already have our localhost open here, and it should start opening it up, and you can see hello world appears in our screen. If you see that mine appears a lot bigger, it's because I'm zooming into my browser just so I can show you guys what's happening in a clearer view. So we have our app over here, and I want to follow what I showed you guys in the beginning, where I want to basically just create an app with two components called a login component and a profile component, and those components should have the purposes that I mentioned in the beginning. The login should allow the user to create an account or like log in as an account and register that information to a user object, and the profile page or the profile component should just display the information that was created through the login component. So to do that, let's come over here, and I'm going to create a folder called components, like this. And inside of here, I want to create two components, the profile component and the login component, like this. And I'm using a snippet in my application, and if you don't know what a snippet is this over here. Let me see. It's ES6, I believe. ES6, 7. I forgot. I think it's this one. Yeah, you can download one of it's not this one, but you can download one of the snippets, and it allows you to create your components immediately by running a command like this. So if I put rfce, it will generate my component automatically with the name of the function, which is the same as the name of the file. So when I save this, and I come over here and I do the same thing, now we have our two components created in our application. And the first thing I want to do is, in our login component, I want to be able to have a button, right? I want to make this as simple as possible. So I want to create a button which allows you to log in. And in our profile, we'll just have a text over here, which will say something like this. It will say profile page, and we'll have over here some information. We'll have a P, which is a paragraph, and it will just include stuff like the user's name, which right now we don't have that information, but we'll also include the user's age and probably the user's email, something like this. These are the information that we really want to keep track of. And as you can see, if I refresh my page, nothing will have happened, because if you didn't realize, we didn't actually do anything with these components. We created them, but they are not being currently rendered. So to actually make them be rendered, we need to come to our app.js and import these components on our top by saying import profile from ./components/profile. So we're importing our components, and I'll do the same for our login component. So ./components/login. And now what I was talking about in the beginning is, think of it as a component tree. This over here is the app component, and we said that the profile and the login components are siblings of each other and are branches from the app component. So the app is the parent, and inside of the app we call its branches or its childs, like the profile one and the login one. And here it becomes a lot clearer the meaning of being siblings of each other. So the login and the profile components are siblings because they exist inside next to each other inside of their parent, which is the app component. And this is what I was pointing out, because if I create a state inside of the login, there's no way I can access it in our profile, because the profile is next to our login and not below our login, which kind of makes sense if you're familiar with props and how states work in React. So now that we've created both of this, you'll see that it appears in our screen now. You see that actually we have this information. This is the profile. It appears on top of the login. And right now nothing is happening. If I click on the login, this doesn't change to show the new values. And this isn't working yet, right? So let's start implementing Redux into our app. So in order to start using Redux in our application, I want to bring back that idea that I mentioned in the beginning. I want to close both of this over here and just open our index.js, which is actually the highest level of our application, because here is where we actually render our app and call the app component, as you can see. So I want to bring back that idea that I mentioned, which is of thinking about a store, right? So a store is almost like thinking of a container, something that holds information, something that holds something. And when you create a store in Redux, it is just a place where you're going to hold all of the states that you want to make global. So all of the states that you want to be able to access throughout your whole application and also be able to change them. So this is what a store is. And in Redux, we're going to create a single store that will contain all of the different states that we might want to change. And it is a little bit more complicated than just holding different states. We actually have to learn some of the notation that is used in Redux. So to start off with this, I want to actually start by creating our store. And if you're using Redux Toolkit, you can very easily do this by coming here to the top and importing something from Redux Toolkit. So I'll just say at Redux Toolkit over here. And I'm going to import something called a configure store function, as you can see. And this allows you to create your store very easily by just coming over here and just saying const store. So we're creating a variable called store and setting it equal to the configure store function. And inside of this function parameters, we're going to pass some information. The main thing we're going to pass is a collection of reducers. And reducers is something that it is built into Redux, and it actually became so common that it was actually presented as well in a hook created by React. So one of the core hooks of React, called the useReducer, uses the same kind of notation. And your store in Redux should contain all of the reducers that might be used in your application. And I'll also get more specific about what reducers are. But for now, let's just set a reducer equal to an empty object because we haven't created any reducers yet. But this is the basic idea of our store. It's just a variable, and we say configure store, and we pass a property inside of an object inside of here called reducer. And over here, we're going to later on add all of our reducers. Now, how do we say that this store should exist inside of our application? Well, we just come over here and import something known as a provider from the React-Redux library. So this is what we're going to be using to basically determine which components should have access to this store, which in theory should be all of them, because this is the whole point of a global state. You can access this information everywhere. So we imported this provider, which is just a component that you wrap around your app component like this. And now everything inside of this provider, which in this case is everything in our app, should have access to this store and the values that you pass to this provider. But how do we tell our provider that this store over here is the store that should contain all of the global states? Well, you just come over here and pass a property called store and say that this store is the one that we want to be using. So this is the basic, right? We created our store and we created a provider, and we just assess both of them and determine that this is the store that we want to be using in our application. So now let's get started with some more specific stuff related to Redux. You see this reducer over here, it's empty, right? So what exactly is a reducer? Well, a reducer is just a function that takes in some information about the current states. So like it takes in the previous value of the state, and it also takes some sort of action that you want to perform on that state, and it returns back the new value of that state. So it seems kind of weird in the beginning, but that's the basic idea of how you're going to be managing your states inside of a Redux application. we're going to have reducers for all of the different states that we want to have in our application, and that's how we're going to be able to also manage them and change them throughout our application. So in our case over here, we have our login and our profile page. So let's think about what reducer or what states do we want to have, right? I think that the one that we want to have for sure is a state called user, which contains the information about the user. And when we log in, we put that information into the user state, and that should automatically display the information over here, because inside of our profile component, we should be accessing that state. And when the values changes, we should see the new values appearing automatically, which is the whole point of having a state, right? So we just thought about it. We want to have a user state. So if we want to have a user state, we need to have a user reducer. So what I want to do over here is I want to create a folder. I'm actually going to call this features, which is how Toolkit recommends us to call it. And inside of here, I will create for now just a file called user.js, which is going to represent our user reducers, our user slice, which is something that I'm going to go more in depth as we go on through the tutorial. Over here, since we're using Toolkit, it actually becomes a lot easier to understand how a reducer actually works. So we're going to actually import something from the Toolkit library, which is, I'm going to say import from the Redux.js toolkit, and we're going to import something called create slice. So this create slice function allows you to create your reducer in a very easy way, where it becomes very intuitive for you to split your logic and be able to access it throughout your application, so that it becomes a lot easier for you to actually change stuff and access those values and different components that you want to have. And the whole point of this is that it becomes organized in a way that it becomes easier to understand. So over here, what I want to do is I want to create something called a user slice, like this, and I want to set it equal to create slice. And here's where we're going to where it's going to contain all the information about the reducer, the actions we want to take on the state, and the actual name of the state. So for a slice, you need to pass some information. You need to pass the name of the slice, which is the same thing as the name of the state, for example. So let's call it user. And we need to pass an initial state, which is, as the name indicates, the initial value that should exist. And I would say that the initial state for the user should be just an empty user. So for our initial state, we actually need to pass a value over here, which is just like we're accessing our value inside of our state. So we need to have a property called value, and inside of here we pass the actual value of our state. So since we said it would be a user, we can come over here and pass that the user would have a name, and as per an initial value, the initial value of our name would be just an empty string, then an age, which is a number, so it would usually be 0, and an email, which would be also an empty string, because that would be the kind of the idea of an empty value, right? So we have an initial state, and the structure of our states will be like this. It will always have a value property, and this value would contain the actual value of the state, which in our case is an object containing name, age, and email. So then over here, we can start to pass our actual reducers functions, and over here we can pass down the actual function the different functions that we might want to use to alter the values of our application. So the reason why Redux Toolkit becomes a lot easier is because you can do all of the logic behind Redux, including creating a reducer, having your different action functions, accessing your state, everything inside of this slice function, inside of this slice object over here, and export it all into your store inside of the same file. It just becomes a lot less boilerplate code, which makes it a lot easier. So to create our reducer over here, let's start by creating the first function that we might want to have. And in our case would be a login function, right? Just a function that would actually create the user. And what I mean by create is it would just change the values of our state to be equal to some sort of user that we want to add. So it would change the name to something that you want to, the name of the user you want to create. It would change the age, and it would change the email. So every reducer function, or every reducer like action that you want to take. In Redux, it takes in a function, and in this function, it takes in two arguments. The first one is the actual state, so the value of the current state, and the second one is called action. And both of them are very different. The state just holds it holds information about the current and previous value of your state. So if this is the first time we're logging into our application and this is still the initial state, then state would be equal to this over here because it is the initial state. But when we change it to a new state, then state would be equal to whatever we changed. So it's just keeping track of what our current state is, and you can see it is exactly what we created. It has name, it has age, and it has email. And then action is something a little bit different. As you can see, it's an object containing two things. One of them is called the payload, and the other is called the type. Now the payload is an object which you can pass in information that you might want to use when changing your state. So it's almost as if you created a function and that takes in some sort of argument, and you use that argument to change the value of a variable. So over here, if we want to change the value of our state of our user to something else, we might want to pass an object containing the new values inside of our payload. So that's kind of how we're going to access that information. And then type, we're not going to be using that much over here because we're not doing anything super complicated, but you can actually trigger different types of actions that you might want to take. So if you want to pass in a type to, I don't know, conditionally do different stuff, you might want to do that as well. And it's very common to use types when you're using normal Redux, but we're not going to be using it that much over here because our application is very simple. So what we're going to be using a lot is the payload in itself, because inside of this function is where you actually do something with the state, you change its value. So when we log in, what we want to do is we want to grab the previous state we had, which is this one over here, and we want to change it to whatever we get from the payload, because that's the new user the new values for the user. So all we have to do here is we just have to say state.value and set it equal to whatever we get from the payload. Very simple, right? We want to change the user, so we change the value, which is this, into whatever we get from the payload. And right now it may not make a lot of sense what exactly is the payload, but when we start actually calling this, you'll see exactly what we mean. And right now, this is all we want to have. We're just going to have this one reducer function, and I'm going to show you guys how to actually use that inside of a React component. So right here at the bottom, what we want to do is we want to export some stuff, right? Because we want to have access to information, to all of the things that we created over here inside of our index.js, so that we can pass it inside of this reducer, and also inside of all of the different components in React that we create, so that we can actually change the value of these states. So in order to do that, the first thing I want to do is I want to export this constant so that we have access to it outside of this file. And then I want to come here at the bottom and I want to export our reducer. And to export our reducer, we're going to export a default, which means that we're not going to export an object or a constant. We're just going to export it in itself, and then we can just grab it by just creating a variable in our other file. So I'm just going to say export default like this. And I'm going to say I want to export the user slice.reducer because I want to access this reducer in our index.js. And the slice is not the same thing as the reducer. The slice contains the reducer, so that's why we say the reducer. And then over here in our index.js, I want to basically just say that I want to import at the top and let's call it user reducer. We can call it whatever you want from the path towards our features /user file. So now over here we can access this user reducer and just set it equal to one of our reducers. So let's create a reducer called user and set it equal to the user reducer that we just imported. So this is how we actually pass all of the reducers we want to have in our app, and we might want to have many of them. So for each reducer you want to create, you need to create a new file inside of this features folder with a new slice, and it goes on like this. This is how I would organize our project. So now that we have imported this user reducer over here, we still want to export our actions, but I want to talk about that later. For now, it's all fine. We can now access this state and this information in different components inside of our React application. So the component that I really want to focus in right now is the profile.js file, right? It's the profile component. Because over here is where we display the information of our state. So right now, I want to grab the value of the state and I just want to be able to display it in our component. So to do that, we need to use something called the UseSelector hook, which is the hook we're going to be using to grab values of our states every time we need to use it. So I'm just going to say import from React-Redux and then import the UseSelector hook. And then if I want to access the user state, all we have to do is we come over here, we say const user, and then we set it equal to the UseSelector hook. And then the UseSelector hook takes in a function which just allows you to specify which state you're trying to talk about, right? Which state do you want to access? So I want to basically grab all of the states like this. And at the end, I want to turn this user variable over here equal to the state.user because we want to access the user. And we also want to access the value of that user because if you recall, our state actually includes a value property, and inside of this value property, there's the actual value that we want. So I want to say state.user.value like this. And now inside of here, we can access the email or the name by saying user.name. And if we want to access the age, we can do the same by saying user.age and then user.email. I'm going to say user.age over here and then user.email over here. Now, since our state initially is empty, all we should see is nothing for the name, nothing for the email because they're empty strings, and a 0 for the age. And if we open our page, you see this is exactly what we see because we're accessing our initial state. But if we change this over here to Pedro, and our email was something like email@gmail.com, you should see that this should be the actual values that appear, right? And it looks perfect, right? It's actually accessing the states that we created in our reducer. So I'm gonna Control Z all of this, and let's leave it as an empty state because now we want to be able to change those values in our profile component. So how do we do that? Well, to do that, we need to have access to all of the functions that we created inside of here, which for now is just a login. So, I mean, we just have to access the actions that we created because that's kind of a concept that we have in Redux, which is of an action. So, Toolkit allows you to do that very easily by coming over here and exporting the different actions that you want to create. So, I'm going to call the first action that we want to export is the login action, which is the login function over here. And I want to make this a constant. And I'm going to set this equal to user_slice.actions because Toolkit allows you to access the actions by just saying user_slice.actions. And now we go to the component which we want to alter the value of the state, which is the login component. And over here, we need to import two things. The first one is another hook from React Redux called the UseDispatch hook, like this. And similar to the UseSelector, Redux has two hooks that are extremely important for you to understand. The UseDispatch hook is used to modify values of your states, and the UseSelector hook is used for accessing values of your states. So for the UseDispatch, we come over here and we want to set create a function called dispatch and set it equal to the UseDispatch function over here. And this should be it for creating our dispatch function. But the thing is, we need to specify when we're calling this what action we're trying to take. And if you recall, we just exported all of the actions, and one of the actions is login, which is exactly what we need. So I'm going to come over here at the top, and I just want to import from our file that we created, the features file /user, and we want to import the login action that we created. And now in our login button, whenever you click on this button, I'm just going to hard code it over here, but I want to basically call the dispatch function right here like this. I want to call dispatch, and to change the value of our state, all we have to do is we just have to first of all pass the information, the action that we want to take, which is login, and then I want to pass a payload inside of here, which is the payload we're accessing over here. So the payload should be just the object containing the new values that we want to set for the user. So I'm going to copy that object and paste it over here. And I want to, for example, whenever I click on this button, I want to set the values of the object to Pedro, the age to 20, the email to pedro@gmail.com, something like this. And with this in mind, it should be working. Let's come over here. I want to refresh the page. You see our state is empty, but when I click on this login button, you can see it changes the value of the state, and whatever payload, whatever object we pass to this action is the payload that we access over here. So this is what I want you guys to keep in mind. Whenever you pass something over here, it should be accessible inside of this function, which means that you can use that information to alter the value of your state. So this is kind of the idea. And now that we kind of understand how the process works, what you need to do in order to get your states to be changing and actually showing that information in your components, let's start by continuing this process and adding more to our reducer. So I want to add here another action, which is the logout action, right? We have the login, and I want to add the logout. So I know this is a simplified version. Obviously, logging in doesn't mean just literally hard coding, like adding a value to an object, but I want to keep this as simple as possible. And for logging out, it will be as well very simple. What I want to do is I just want to have a simple function which will follow the same notation. It's a function that takes in a state and an action, and we make the arrow function over here. And the logout function, all it does is it clears out the object to its original state. So if we have a user and the user is like this, and we click a logout button, we want to remove the name to be an empty string. We want to make the age 0, and we want to make the email an empty string again. We want to set it back to what it was initially. So there's a couple ways of doing this. The main clearer way of doing this would be to coming over here and saying that when you call the logout function, you want to set the state.value to be equal to whatever this is over here. We want to copy this. This is the empty state, so we want to set it like this. And this should work. It works perfectly because we are setting the state to be equal to its empty value. But what I don't like is that we're reusing this object twice. So what you might want to do is whenever you create a slice, we can create a constant over here, and I'm going to call it initial state value. And I want to set it equal to this over here. So I want to set it equal to this, which is the value of our initial state. So instead of passing it like this, we can just say that the value of our initial state is the variable initial state value that we created. And now if we want to alter it and reset it back to what it was in the beginning, we just have to set the value to the initial state value, which is just the empty values that we created. So this should work. And as you can see, we're also not using the action in this function, so we don't really need the action over here. We can just have the state. And now all we have to do to access this outside of our components is by passing the function over here. This is the whole process, right? We need to follow the steps every time we want to create a new action. And I'll show you guys as well how would be the process for adding new reducers or new actual slices to our project. So for now, let's just follow the process for adding a new action. We pass the action over here, which means that we can now access it in our React components. And inside of this React component over here, the login, I'm going to have another button, which is going to be the logout button. And I'm going to say logout. And over here, I want to have, again, an onClick. And instead of, we're going to dispatch an action. But instead of dispatching the action for logging in, I want to copy all of this over here and put it over here. Instead of logging in, we want to call the action logout. So I need to import logout over here. And I want to pass logout over here. Now, logout doesn't take a payload, so we don't even need to pass anything inside of it. It just resets everything back to how it was initially. So if we open this up over here and I refresh my page, you see we have the logout button. If I click on login, it fills all the information. But if I click on logout, it removes the information. I can keep clicking on them, and it works perfectly. It alters the state, and it acts as if it is an actual state that you created with the useState hook. It will re-render the page to show the new values, which is exactly what we want. But the good thing is we can actually access all of these variables and all of the states anywhere in our application. Now, this is great. This was a very simple example that I wanted to show. However, as the last example, I want to actually show you guys how would we go if we wanted to add more reducers to our application. So we have a user reducer, but we really want to keep in mind that the whole point of this is we need to have many states that are managed separately but are contained in the same store, right? We want to have many different states that handle our application, and they might not be really connected to each other, but the point of Redux as well is actually being able to handle all of that in an organized way. So let's think about another state that we might want to have in this simple application. So I actually thought about a good, cool example that might not be really useful in real life, but it's something that I think exemplifies exactly what we've been working on. And basically what I want to do is I want to have a button in my application which when you click on it, it will change the color of the text for every single text inside of our website, right? So this is a good example because like in many websites, you have the dark and light theme buttons that you can toggle at the top. And you might wonder, how do they actually pass that information throughout the application? How do every component knows that it's actually a dark theme or light theme? So this would be a good example in my opinion, and I want to show you guys something similar to that. So we have here our two components, the profile page, and we have the login component. So what I really want to do is I just really want to create a new component down here at the bottom, which is going to be the change color component. It's just a simple component which I'm going to create, and all it does is it actually just has a button over here, and I want to click on it, and whenever you click on it, it will change color. And the good thing is you can write the color that you want to change to. So you might want to change it to green, so you write green and it will change the color to green. If you want to change it to blue, it will change it to blue. So that's one of the things I'm kind of thinking about. So to do something like this, we need an input because we want to be able to write on the, like, choose which color we want, and this input will be of type text, like this. And this is a good example in my opinion because many people think that you don't use the useState hook, or you don't really work with states if you're using something like Redux. But that's completely wrong because there are some states that you want to handle them locally, and some states that you want to handle globally. So for all the states that are global, you work with Redux. But for states that are local, you work with whatever you want to work with. In my opinion, you should use the core React hooks. So we're going to be using over here the React, the useState hook from React, which will allow us to basically just determine which color we're currently writing on our input. So I'll come over here and I'll say, okay, I want to create a color and then set color, and I want to come over here and I want to set this equal to useState, and inside of this useState hook, this will be a string because it will be the color that we want to choose. And in this input, basically what we want is we want to tell our user that whenever you write on this input, so whichever color you write over here, we'll change the value of our color state to represent the new color that you wrote on the input. So I'll grab the event over here, and I'll just say that every time there's a change in the input, we want to set the color to be equal to event.target.value, which is a very common thing in React. We're just setting the state to be equal to whatever you wrote in this input. And now what we really want is we want to start creating our reducers for the color. So we want to create some sort of reducer in our application that will hold information about the theme of our app. So anything related to colors, anything related to if it's dark theme or light theme, it's just another example of global states that you might want to have in your application. So to do that, I'm gonna first of all close everything over here, and I want to create a new file in our features folder. Let's call it theme.js, but you can call it whatever you want. Again, it's not, there's no standard. I'm just creating stuff as we go. And I want to copy everything that I created for the user slice because the good thing about boilerplate code is that it takes a long time in the beginning to set up, but then you can just copy and paste what you've already done in the past. So I actually pasted twice. Let's just keep it like this. And what I want to do is I want to change this because now we're creating a theme slice, right? That's the name that we want to give. Let's call it theme slice. And down here at the bottom, for every time we say user slice, let's change it to theme slice. And obviously right now we don't have any actions, so I'm just going to delete those over here. And we want to change this to, instead of this slice being called user, let's call it theme. Then for the initial state, we want to have the same thing. However, the initial state value shouldn't be an object. In our case right now, we really need to think about what we really want. And in this case over here, I just want to keep it simple. I want to keep it as a string because it will just be a caller, a single caller that you can change. So our theme slice will just represent that single caller that you choose to represent all the texts that you have. So over here, we'll keep it as a string. And if you write blue, this state value will become blue. If you write red, it will become red. So this should be fine. I'm going to delete all of this over here. Actually, I'll just keep one of them. And we want to create our first action that we might want to take whenever we are using this theme slice, right? So what is the action we want to take? Well, we really just want to change the color, right? We want to change the color to whatever the user wrote over there. So I want to create this action called change color, and it will take in the state and the action because we really want to access which color the user put over here. So when we dispatch this action, we want to pass the color that the user chose, that the user wrote in the input, and pass it in to this theme action payload. So we can basically just say state.value equals to action.payload because the payload will be a string and it will be the actual color that we want. So this over here should be fine, and we can copy this and pass it to our actions that we're exporting because we want to access it elsewhere. So now that we created a new slice and we want to use it in our application, all we have to do is we come here to our index.js and we have to add this reducer to our store. So we just come over here, we give it a name, let's call it theme, and we can just say that this theme will be represented by the, and we need to import the theme reducer. And we import it from ./features/theme. And then over here, we just pass the theme reducer. And now we should have access to all of the states and all of the actions that we created in this slice. So this is one of the good things. It becomes a lot easier and simpler and faster after you've done the first one because you just copy and paste and change some stuff. So now we come here to our change color component and we import some stuff because we really want to import the UseDispatch hook because we want to be able to dispatch that action. So we just say import from React-Redux and we import the UseDispatch hook. Then we come down here as we did before. We say const dispatch equals to the UseDispatch hook. And inside of here, what we really want to dispatch is the change color action that we just created inside of our theme.js slice. So we need to import that as well. I'll just say import from actually I need to go twice back. So /features/theme, and we need to import the change color function. And now over here, when we click on this button, what we really want to do is we want to unclick call a function that calls that dispatch like this. So we want to dispatch the change color action, and we just pass the change color action. But if you recall, this action takes in a payload, and the payload is just a string. So we just pass the color that we want from the state over here, and now we should know which color we want to change it to. So this should be fine. It is changing the value of the state. If I come over here, I actually haven't called the change color component in our app.js, so I'll do that right now. I'll just come over here and say change color, and it should import automatically like this. And you'll see that now we have the button appearing, maybe. Yeah, we have the button and the input. And if I actually come over here and say blue, and I click on this button, internally it is changing the value of our color state that we created in our theme.js. This over here is actually changing. However, we're not demonstrating that anywhere. So what I want to do is I want to actually come inside of our all of our other components, like the profile page, and I want to import actually I already have the UseSelector, so I want to select a new state from our store. So to do that, we just call the UseSelector again, and I want to call this theme or theme color, whatever we want. And from the state, we grab the state.theme.value because now we have access to our color. And what we do is I want to come to our div over here, and I want to give it a style. And the style will just be, I'll just change the color of anything inside of this profile to be equal to the theme color. Not the theme color, like this. And now it should change everything inside of here to have the color equal to the theme color in our global state. So you see that we wrote blue, it becomes blue, but if we write green, like this, it should become green. If we write red, it should become red. And the good thing about this is that everything is handled separately, so we have two states that are siblings and we can change everything perfectly. And you see it's working, right? If I click on login, everything, the other state also is handled. If I click logout, it also works. If I change this to pink, it will work as well. Now, obviously this change color thing isn't that good because if I write something here that isn't a color, I think it will break. It didn't break, but you see it didn't change the color. Yeah, it didn't break, but it didn't change the color because we're manually like choosing which color we want to change to. But I think it's really cool, and it does exemplify how it is the process for creating new states, for creating new reducers, for creating new slices, and how you can actually manage many states that you might want to use in a component by using the UseSelector twice inside of the same component. So I really hope that this tutorial was of value for you guys. I really spent a lot of time trying to figure out some good examples that balances out being beginner friendly, but also being able to explain to you guys some real life examples. So I could have easily done a tutorial using by creating something like a counter, but I didn't really want to do it because first of all, there's already too many counter tutorials out there, and because I think it's not really useful to exemplify why we need Redux or why we use a state management library, because rarely you would need a state management library for something like a counter. However, you do need it whenever you have an application like this one where you have a user and you want to access the user's information throughout the application, but then you want to change that information in different components, or something like the color one, which I've seen so many websites with the change theme toggle. So I really had a hard time trying to figure out which examples would be good, and I really hope you guys gain as much value as possible from this tutorial. If you have any questions, leave the questions down below. I'll be answering all of them. If you want to check out the code, all the code will be in the description. I created a GitHub repository where you can just take a look at the code. You can grab it to your computer. If something's not working, you can try out just copy and pasting from my code and then comparing to see what mistakes you made. So that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment on what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting as much as I can, and I would massively appreciate it if you guys could support the channel. We're almost hitting 20k subs, and this is mind-blowing for me, honestly. So I'm really happy with the way the channel is growing, and I would appreciate if you guys could help out. So that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.